She leaped from a thundering locomotive at full speed to escape the men who stole her freedom. But when a 7-year-old Comanche girl found her broken and bleeding in the Texas desert, she whispered words that would change 3 lives forever. "Papa, don't let her die," the iron beast screamed across the barren Texas plains, its black smoke staining the endless blue sky like a scar against heaven itself. Inside the swaying passenger car, shackled wrists pressed against cold metal as desperate eyes watched the landscape blur past at deadly speed. The year was 1869, and the westbound railroad carried more than passengers and cargo. It carried secrets, sins, and souls, trapped between one hell and another. The locomotive's whistle shrieked like a banshee as it devoured mile after mile of unforgiving terrain, each rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel counting down to a destination that promised nothing but misery. Isabel Morrison had been many things in her 24 years. A banker's daughter in Philadelphia, raised in marble halls and velvet parlors. A reluctant debutante who stumbled through cotillions and charity balls with the grace of a caged wildcat. A woman who dared to speak when silence was expected, who read philosophy when embroidery was prescribed, who dreamed of adventures beyond the suffocating confines of proper society. But for the past 6 weeks, she had been something else entirely, a prisoner. The men who took her called it marriage arrangements, called it family business, called it anything but what it truly was. Slavery wrapped in legal papers and false promises. Human trafficking disguised as civilized transaction. Her captors sat 3 rows ahead, playing cards and drinking whiskey as if they weren't transporting human cargo across state lines. Marcus Thornfield and his brother Dale, men her father owed money to when his bank investments turned to dust and his gambling debts mounted like winter snow. They were debt collectors of the cruelest sort, men who had collected their payment in flesh when gold ran short and desperation made monsters of civilized men. They spoke of her as property, discussed her future husband in Arizona territory like ranchers trading livestock at market. A mining baron named Ezekiel Crenshaw, who paid handsomely for young wives and asked no questions about how they arrived. A man who went through women like he went through mine shafts, discarding them when they broke. The train rounded a sharp curve, wheels shrieking against steel rails as the car tilted precariously toward the abyss that yawned beside the mountain track. Through the grimy window, Belle glimpsed what lay ahead in the growing dusk. Miles of empty desert, dotted with scrub brush and red rock formations that rose like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. A landscape so vast and hostile it seemed to mock human ambition. Behind her sat the life she had known, the gilded cage of Philadelphia society with its rules and restrictions and suffocating expectations. Ahead waited a fate worse than death, a lifetime of servitude to a man who viewed women as disposable commodities. But in this moment, suspended between past and future, racing through the wilderness at breakneck speed, she made a choice that would echo across the wasteland. Her fingers worked frantically at the window latch, nails breaking against the rusted metal as precious seconds ticked away like drops of blood. The Thornfield brothers were deep in their card game, bottles clinking with each violent jolt of the train as it navigated the treacherous mountain passes. The passengers dozed fitfully in the afternoon heat or stared blankly at the passing scenery, lost in their own private miseries. The conductor had passed through an hour ago, his eyes sliding over Belle with the practiced indifference of a man who had seen too much human suffering to care about one more broken soul. No one noticed a young woman preparing to bet her life on a leap of faith into the void. The window finally yielded with a grinding protest of metal against metal, as if the train itself was reluctant to release its captive cargo. Desert air rushed in, hot and dry and tasting of dust and distant rain, carrying scents of sage and mesquite and something indefinably wild. Belle gathered her torn skirts, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. She had no plan beyond escape, no destination except away from the nightmare her life had become. The ground raced past in a brown blur far below, a carpet of rocks and thorns and unforgiving earth that promised pain but offered the one thing she craved more than safety: freedom. For a moment, she hesitated on the precipice of decision. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in drawing rooms and finishing schools, screamed warnings about broken bones and certain death. Ladies didn't leap from moving trains, didn't risk everything on desperate gambles, didn't choose potential death over guaranteed suffering. But rationality had abandoned her the night armed men dragged her from her bedroom window while her father counted blood money in his study below, too deep in debt and despair to protect his only child. Sometimes survival demanded madness, demanded the impossible leap into the unknown, demanded faith in gravity and grace and the slim chance that freedom was worth any price. Belle swung one leg over the windowsill, then the other, perching on the narrow ledge like a bird about to take flight into the gathering storm. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face, and the train's whistle screamed as if sensing her intention to abandon ship. Below, the desert waited with patient cruelty, an endless expanse of red sand and scattered rocks that would either catch her fall or become her grave. She closed her eyes, whispered a prayer to whatever gods watched over desperate women and lost souls, and jumped into the swirling darkness. The world exploded into chaos, a kaleidoscope of wind and noise, and the sickening sensation of falling through space with nothing but hope and gravity as companions. She hit the ground with bone-jarring force, her body tumbling across rocks and sand like a broken doll, cast aside by an angry child in a fit of rage. Pain bloomed everywhere at once, a symphony of agony that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness. Her shoulder, her ribs, her head spinning as the world tilted and spun like a child's top knocked askew. The taste of blood filled her mouth, copper and salt, and the bitter flavor of mortality. Behind her, the train continued its relentless journey west, carrying her captors toward their destination while she lay crumpled in the dirt like discarded refuse. The sound of wheels on steel faded into the distance, replaced by the vast silence of the desert night. For long moments, she could only breathe and marvel at the simple miracle of being alive, of having functioning lungs and a beating heart, despite the violence of her landing. Her dress was torn beyond repair, expensive silk reduced to rags. Her hands were scraped raw, palms embedded with sand and gravel. Something warm trickled down her forehead, and she tasted salt when it reached her lips. But she was free, broken and bleeding and lost in a desert that stretched to every horizon, but gloriously, impossibly free. The sun climbed higher as hours passed, turning the air into a shimmering furnace that sucked moisture from her already parched throat. Belle struggled to sit up, her vision swimming as the world tilted dangerously around her like a ship in a storm. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her battered body, reminders of the price she had paid for freedom. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, not broken, she hoped, but certainly damaged beyond immediate use. Blood dripped steadily from a gash above her eyebrow, mixing with sweat and dust to paint crimson trails down her cheek like war paint. Her ribs ached with each shallow breath, suggesting cracks if not breaks in the delicate architecture of bone. She tried to stand and immediately collapsed as her right ankle refused to bear weight, buckling like a house built on sand. The joint was already swelling to twice its normal size, turning purple beneath her torn stockings. Panic crept up her throat like bile, threatening to choke her with its bitter taste. She had escaped her captors only to face a slower death under the merciless Texas sun, traded one form of torture for another. No water, no shelter, no idea which direction led to civilization. If any direction did in this God-forsaken wilderness that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. The landscape around her was alien and hostile, a terrain that belonged to no civilized map she had ever studied. Red sand stretching endlessly in all directions, broken only by clusters of thorny mesquite and the occasional skeletal remains of some long-dead tree that stood like a monument to futility. Vultures circled overhead with patient hunger, their shadows wheeling across the ground like harbingers of doom, counting down the hours until feast time. In the distance, heat mirages danced like spirits, promising water that existed only in her desperate imagination, cruel illusions that mocked her thirst. Hours crawled by in a haze of pain and mounting thirst that turned her tongue to leather and her thoughts to scattered fragments. Belle crawled from shadow to shadow, following the meager shade cast by scattered rocks as the sun traced its burning arc across the pitiless sky. Her once fine dress collected burrs and thorns, the fabric that had once marked her as a lady of quality, now marking her as carrion for the desert scavengers. Her lips cracked and bled, her throat closed to a painful whisper. Delirium crept in at the edges of her consciousness, like fog rolling in from the sea, bringing visions of cool streams and her mother's garden back in Philadelphia. Images of safety and comfort that dissolved like smoke when she tried to grasp them with failing hands. The memories came in waves as her mind began to fracture under the assault of heat and hopelessness. She remembered her mother's rose garden, where they used to take tea on summer afternoons, while discussing books that proper ladies weren't supposed to read. Her mother had died when Belle was 16, taking with her the only voice of support for her daughter's unconventional dreams. After that, her father had grown distant, burying himself in business deals that grew increasingly desperate as his luck turned sour. The man who had once read her bedtime stories became a stranger who saw her only as an asset to be leveraged when his debts came due. It was then, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon and painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, that she heard the sound that would change everything, the soft whisper of unshod hooves against sand, a rhythm as old as the plains themselves. Belle forced her eyes open, squinting through the wavering heat toward the source of the sound. At first, she thought it was another mirage, another cruel trick of her dying mind, conjuring salvation where none existed. But the figures approaching through the desert haze were solid, real and growing larger with each passing moment, materializing from the shimmering air like prayers given form. Two riders emerged from the heat waves like spirits crossing between worlds. The larger figure sat straight and proud on a paint horse that moved with liquid grace across the uneven ground, each step deliberate and sure despite the treacherous footing. Even at a distance, Belle could see the man's long black hair flowing behind him like a dark banner, adorned with feathers that caught the dying light and seemed to glow with inner fire. His skin was bronze, weathered by years under the open sky, his bearing regal despite the simple leather clothing he wore. This was clearly a warrior, a man who belonged to this harsh land in ways Belle never could, someone who had been shaped by the desert rather than broken by it. Beside him rode a smaller figure, a child barely visible atop a spotted pony that seemed almost too large for its young rider. As they drew closer, Belle could make out delicate features framed by two neat braids that bounced with each step of the pony, decorated with small shells and colored beads that caught the light. A little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with curious dark eyes that missed nothing in their survey of the desert floor, scanning the landscape with the attention of one trained from birth to read the stories written in sand and stone. The child saw her first, pointing with obvious excitement toward Belle's crumpled form, while speaking rapidly to her companion. The man, her father, surely, followed her gaze and immediately urged his horse forward, his posture shifting from casual patrol to alert concern in the space of a heartbeat. Belle tried to speak, to call out, but only managed a rasping whisper that barely carried beyond her own ears, her voice reduced to the scratch of sand against stone. She raised one trembling hand in a gesture that was half greeting, half plea for mercy, unsure whether these strangers would prove to be salvation or simply a different form of doom. They reined in their horses a dozen yards away, close enough for Belle to see the intricate beadwork on the man's vest, the careful braiding of his daughter's hair, the wariness in his dark eyes as he studied this strange woman who had appeared in his territory like a fallen star. For long moments nobody moved, the tableau frozen in the amber light of approaching dusk. Belle held her breath, acutely aware that her life hung in the balance of whatever decision this Comanche warrior would make, whether he would see her as threat, burden, or simply another piece of desert flotsam to be left for the vultures. The little girl spoke first, her voice clear and musical in the desert stillness, cutting through the tension like water through drought-cracked earth. Though Belle could not understand the words, the tone was unmistakably one of concern, of a child's instinctive compassion for suffering that had not yet been educated out of her by the harsh realities of survival. The girl tugged at her father's arm, pointing again at Belle with increasing urgency, her small face creased with worry. Dark eyes bright with unshed tears for a stranger's pain. The man, Satanta, though Belle did not yet know his name or the weight it carried among his people, studied her with the patience of one who had learned to read the desert's moods and meanings in every grain of sand. He saw the torn dress that spoke of wealth and refinement, fabric too fine for this country and now reduced to expensive rags. He saw the pale skin that marked her as an outsider, someone who had never learned to live under the open sky. Most telling of all, he saw the injuries that suggested violence rather than accident, the particular pattern of damage that spoke of human cruelty rather than natural misfortune. And he saw no horse, no supplies, no indication of how a lone woman had come to be dying in the middle of nowhere. His daughter, Kiyu, 7 years old and wise beyond her years, in the way of children who had seen too much loss too early, saw something different entirely. Where her father saw a potential threat or at best a problem to be solved, she saw pain that echoed her own, suffering that called to the empty spaces in her heart. The child had lost her mother 2 winters ago to the spotted sickness that swept through their band like wildfire, taking the strong and weak alike without discrimination. She recognized the hollow look of someone clinging to life by will alone. The desperate hope warring with resignation in Belle's blue eyes. The particular quality of aloneness that came from having nowhere left to run. Kiyu slipped from her pony with the fluid grace of one born to the saddle and approached Belle despite her father's sharp word of warning, moving with the fearless curiosity that was both a child's greatest strength and most dangerous weakness. She knelt in the sand beside the injured woman, her small hands hovering uncertainly as if wanting to help but not knowing how, drawn by an instinct older than language or custom. Belle managed a weak smile, the first genuine expression of warmth she had worn in weeks, and something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that transcended the barriers of race and language and circumstance. The little girl turned back to her father, speaking rapidly in the flowing syllables of Comanche, her voice rising and falling like wind through prairie grass. Though Belle could not understand the words, the meaning was clear in Kiyu's earnest tone, in the way she gestured between Belle and Satanta with obvious pleading, in the set of her small shoulders that spoke of determination beyond her years. The child was asking, no, demanding, that her father help this stranger who had fallen from the sky like a broken bird. Satanta's response was measured, cautious, spoken in the low tones of a man who had learned that mercy could be a luxury his people could not afford. Belle caught fragments of meaning in his tone, if not his words. The universal language of concern for his daughter's safety, uncertainty about taking in an outsider who might bring trouble to their camp, the practical difficulties of caring for someone so badly injured when resources were already stretched thin by the demands of survival. But Kiyu was insistent, her voice rising with the passionate conviction that only children possess when they believe absolutely in the rightness of their cause. When moral clarity has not yet been clouded by experience and compromise. Finally, the little girl played her trump card, speaking a single sentence that cut through her father's hesitation like an arrow finding its mark. Belle saw the change immediately, watched as Satanta's expression softened, his shoulders relaxed, and something that might have been resignation or perhaps acceptance crossed his weathered features. Though she could not understand the words, Belle somehow knew that Kyu had said something like, "Papa, don't let her die." The decision hung in the desert air like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with consequence and the weight of unspoken fears. Satanta studied the broken woman before him, calculating risks with the cold precision of a man who had survived by making difficult choices in impossible situations. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his paint horse, knuckles showing white beneath bronze skin, as he weighed his daughter's plea against the harsh realities of their existence. Taking in a stranger, especially a white woman, could bring soldiers, could bring questions, could bring the kind of attention that got entire villages burned to ash and scattered to the four winds. But Kyu's words echoed in his mind like thunder across the plains, carrying with them the memory of another woman who had once begged him not to let someone die. His wife, Ayana, had spoken those same words 2 winters ago when the spotted sickness ravaged their band, when warriors and children alike fell like leaves in an early frost. She had tended the sick until the fever claimed her too, whispering with her last breath that mercy was the only thing that separated humans from the beasts that roamed the wilderness. Now her daughter stood before him, channeling that same spirit of compassion that had defined her mother's short but luminous life. Satanta dismounted with fluid grace, his moccasined feet silent on the sand as he approached the injured woman. Belle watched him come with a mixture of hope and terror, acutely aware that her fate rested in the hands of a man whose people had every reason to hate her kind. The Comanche had been at war with white settlers for generations, their hunting grounds carved up by railroads and their buffalo herds slaughtered by hide hunters, who left the meat to rot under the scorching sun. She had no right to expect mercy from this warrior, no claim on his compassion except the universal bond of shared humanity. He knelt beside her, dark eyes assessing her injuries with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen too much violence, who could read the story of trauma written in blood and bruises. His hands moved with surprising gentleness as he examined her wounded ankle, probing carefully for breaks while she bit her lip to keep from crying out. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, carrying the cadence of wind through canyon walls. Though she could not understand his words, Belle heard kindness in his tone, a warmth that seemed at odds with the fierce reputation of his people. Kyu hovered nearby, translating her father's questions with the earnest intensity of a child thrust into the role of interpreter. She pointed to Belle's torn dress, to the cuts on her hands, to the desperation that clung to her like smoke from a signal fire. The little girl's broken English came haltingly, words learned from traders and missionaries mixed with Comanche phrases that painted pictures Belle could barely comprehend. "Papa asked where you come from, where your people. Why you here alone like lost buffalo calf?" Belle struggled to form words, her throat parched and swollen from thirst and terror. She pointed weakly toward the east, toward the railroad tracks that disappeared into the shimmering distance like twin snakes slithering toward some promised land that existed only in the dreams of desperate men. "Train," she croaked, the single word scraping her throat like broken glass. "Bad men." "I jumped," Q translated rapidly, her young voice rising with excitement as understanding dawned. The child had seen the great iron horse that crossed their territory, belching smoke and noise as it carried white people to places her father said were cursed by greed and sorrow. Satanta's expression darkened as comprehension settled over him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He had heard stories of the flesh traders who moved human cargo along the railroad lines, men who dealt in misery and called it business. The whites spoke of their civilization and laws, while their criminals operated with impunity, buying and selling women like livestock at market. His jaw tightened as he looked at Belle's injuries again, seeing them now through the lens of understanding. This woman had not merely fallen from the train. She had chosen to leap into the unknown rather than endure whatever fate awaited her at journey's end. The warrior rose to his feet, decision crystallizing in his dark eyes like ice forming on winter streams. He spoke to his daughter in rapid Comanche, gesturing toward Belle and then toward the distant mountains where their village lay hidden among the red rocks and twisted junipers. Kiyu clapped her hands with joy, bouncing on her toes as she realized her father had chosen mercy over caution. "Papa say we take you home," she announced proudly. "He say the spirit sent you to us for reason we don't understand yet, but understanding come in time, like rain after drought." But moving Belle would require careful planning and considerable effort. Her injuries were severe enough that rough handling could prove fatal, and the journey to their village would take the better part of 2 days over terrain that challenged even healthy riders. Satanta retrieved a water skin from his saddle, supporting Belle's head as she drank greedily, the precious liquid bringing the first relief she had felt since her desperate leap from the speeding locomotive. The water tasted of leather and smoke, and something indefinably wild. Nothing like the refined refreshments of her former life, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever consumed. As Belle's desperate thirst was partially slaked, Satanta began the delicate process of assessing how to transport her without causing further damage. He examined the makeshift travois that could be constructed from his horse's gear, calculating weight distribution and the jarring effects of travel over uneven ground. His paint horse was strong and sure-footed, bred for endurance rather than speed, but carrying double loads across desert terrain would test even its considerable stamina. The nearest water was half a day's ride, and Belle's condition made speed essential even as her injuries demanded caution. Kiyu proved invaluable as an interpreter and assistant, her small hands quick to gather the soft grasses and prickly pear pads that her father indicated for makeshift bandages. The child had learned the healing arts at her mother's side, absorbing knowledge that most white doctors would dismiss as primitive superstition, despite its proven effectiveness. She chewed bitter herbs to release their medicinal properties, creating poultices that would reduce swelling and fight infection. Her young voice provided constant reassurance to Belle, chattering in broken English about their village, about the other women who would help care for her, about the good spirits that had guided them to this place at this moment. As Satanta worked to fashion a travois from traveler's gear and desert materials, Belle found herself studying the man who held her life in his calloused hands. He moved with the unconscious grace of someone born to this harsh landscape, every gesture economical and purposeful. His weathered face bore the marks of sun and wind and hard living, but there was kindness in the lines around his eyes, a gentleness that spoke of a man who chose strength over cruelty when both options were available. His hands, scarred from countless battles and hunts, worked with surprising delicacy as he bound her injured ankle with strips of soft leather. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as preparations continued, turning the air into a furnace that sapped strength from the healthy and threatened to finish what the train wreck had started. Satanta rigged a makeshift shelter using his horse blanket and a dead mesquite branch, creating precious shade that might mean the difference between life and death for his unexpected patient. He worked silently, conserving energy and moisture while his mind calculated distances and dangers. The desert was unforgiving to those who made mistakes, and he carried not only his own life and his daughter's, but now the responsibility for this broken stranger who had fallen into their care. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kiyu appointed herself Belle's guardian and companion, sitting in the narrow strip of shade and regaling her with stories about their band, about the hidden valley where they made their winter camp, about the grandmother who knew every healing song and could call rain from empty skies. The child's innocence and enthusiasm provided a stark contrast to the gravity of their situation, her belief in good outcomes unwavering despite the harsh realities that surrounded them. She spoke of her mother with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had learned too young that death was simply another part of life's great circle. "Mama went to spirit world when sickness came," Kiyu explained, her voice carrying no self-pity. only the profound sadness of loss mixed with genuine hope for reunion. But she sends signs sometimes. Yesterday, Eagle flew 3 circles over our lodge, and Papa say that means something important coming. Today we find you, so maybe Eagle was telling truth about spirits watching over us. Belle felt tears prick her eyes at the child's simple faith, at the profound trust that had led this little girl to see divine providence in the chance encounter that had saved her life. As the shadows lengthened and the brutal heat began to ease slightly, Satanta completed his preparations for the journey ahead. The travois was crude but functional, designed to distribute Belle's weight evenly while providing as much cushioning as possible against the inevitable jolts and bumps of desert travel. He had fashioned a canopy from spare clothing and horse gear, creating protection from the sun that could mean survival in a land where exposure killed as surely as bullets or blades. Every detail had been considered, every potential problem anticipated with the thoroughness of a man who understood that failure meant death for all concerned. The warrior helped Belle onto the travois with infinite care, his strong hands supporting her weight as waves of pain washed over her battered body. She bit back cries of agony as her injuries protested the movement, but relief flooded through her as she settled onto the makeshift stretcher that represented safety and hope. For the first time since her desperate leap from the speeding train, she dared to believe that she might actually survive this ordeal, that the desert would not claim her bones after all. The simple human kindness of strangers had proved stronger than the cruelty of those who should have protected her. Kiyu mounted her spotted pony with practiced ease, taking point as their small caravan prepared to leave the site of Belle's near-death experience. The child chattered excitedly about the journey ahead, about the people Belle would meet, about the celebrations that would welcome a new member to their extended family. In her young mind, the matter was already settled. Belle would recover. She would learn their ways. She would become part of their circle, just as surely as the sun would rise tomorrow. The possibility of failure simply did not exist in Kiyu's worldview, and her confidence proved contagious. Satanta led his paint horse with steady determination, setting a pace that balanced urgency with the need to minimize jarring for his injured passenger. The travois moved smoothly across the sandy ground, its crude construction proving surprisingly effective at cushioning the worst impacts. The warrior's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for threats both human and natural. Renegade soldiers, rival war parties, flash floods, and predators all posed dangers to their small group, made more vulnerable by their slow pace and human cargo. As they traveled, Belle found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not as the hostile wasteland she had first perceived, but as a complex ecosystem that sustained those who understood its rhythms and respected its power. Satanta pointed out landmarks and resources, water sources hidden beneath seemingly barren ground, plants that could provide food or medicine, the subtle signs that indicated safe passage or warned of danger ahead. This was his university, his library, his sacred text written in stone and sand, an endless sky. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that transformed the harsh landscape into something approaching beauty. Belle watched the light play across distant mesas and rock formations, creating an ever-changing panorama that spoke of geological forces beyond human comprehension. For the first time since childhood, she felt small in a way that was comforting rather than frightening. Part of something larger than her individual struggles and fears. Kiyu's voice carried back to them on the evening breeze, a mixture of Comanche lullabies and broken English commentary that provided a musical accompaniment to their journey. The child seemed tireless, her natural exuberance undiminished by the day's dramatic events. She rode with the casual confidence of someone born to the saddle, her small body moving in perfect harmony with her pony's gait. Her presence transformed what could have been a grim death march into something resembling a family outing, complete with songs and stories and the kind of innocent hope that made survival possible. As darkness began to creep across the desert floor, Setanta called a halt near a cluster of large boulders that would provide shelter from wind and concealment from unfriendly eyes. The night would be dangerous, filled with predators both animal and human, but Belle's condition made continuous travel impossible. She needed rest, medical attention, and time for her body to begin the slow process of healing. The warrior began preparing their camp with the same methodical care he had shown throughout the day, every action calculated to maximize their chances of surviving until dawn. The first night in the desert would test them all, but they faced it together, bound by the invisible threads of compassion and circumstance that had brought them to this moment. Belle closed her eyes and listened to the voices of her rescuers, to Q's gentle chatter and Setanta's deep responses, and felt something she had not experienced in months, the profound peace that came from being truly safe, truly protected, truly home. The Comanche village emerged from the Red Canyon walls like a vision from another world, hidden so perfectly among the twisted rock formations that Belle would have ridden past without seeing it if not for the thin wisps of smoke that betrayed human habitation. Dozens of buffalo hide tipis dotted the canyon floor, their conical shapes arranged in careful patterns that spoke of ancient traditions and deep understanding of wind patterns and water flow. Children's laughter echoed off the stone walls, mixing with the sounds of horses nickering and women singing as they worked. After 3 days of traveling through seemingly empty wilderness, the sudden abundance of life felt like awakening from a fever dream. Word of their approach had preceded them, carried by scouts who had watched their slow progress across the desert with the patient attention of guardian spirits. As Setanta guided his paint horse into the village proper, people emerged from their lodges with the curious reverence reserved for witnessing something unprecedented. Belle, barely conscious on her travois, represented a puzzle that challenged everything they understood about the world beyond their canyon sanctuary. White women simply did not appear broken and bleeding in their territory, rescued by their war chief and claimed by their children as family. An elderly woman approached with the measured dignity of someone whose authority transcended titles and formal recognition. Grandmother Spotted Owl had seen 70 winters, her face mapped with lines that told stories of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. Her silver hair hung in 2 neat braids adorned with shells and turquoise beads that caught the afternoon light like captured stars. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom, the kind of knowledge that came only from surviving decades in a land that tested every breath. She questioned Setanta in rapid Comanche, her sharp eyes never leaving Belle's pale face. Q bounced excitedly beside her father's horse, chattering at breakneck speed as she recounted their adventure to anyone within hearing distance. Her words painted Belle as a mystical figure, a sky woman who had fallen from the iron horse as a gift from the spirit world. The child's imagination had transformed the desperate leap from a speeding train into an epic tale of divine intervention, complete with eagles and prophecies and mysterious purposes yet to be revealed. Her enthusiasm proved infectious, drawing a growing crowd of curious observers who had never seen anything quite like the broken stranger on the travois. Spotted Owl approached Belle with the careful attention of a healer assessing damage, her gnarled hands gentle as they probed for breaks and internal injuries that might not be immediately visible. She spoke softly in Comanche, her tone carrying the universal language of medical authority as she issued orders to the women who had gathered around the travois. Belle found herself lifted with surprising gentleness and carried toward a large teepee whose entrance was decorated with symbols that spoke of healing and protection. The scent of burning sage filled her nostrils, along with other herbs whose names she did not know but whose purpose was unmistakably medicinal. The interior of the healing lodge was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the harsh desert sun that had been her constant companion for days. Buffalo robes and woven blankets created a soft nest where Belle was placed with infinite care, surrounded by the tools of Spotted Owl's trade. Bundles of dried plants hung from the lodge poles, their shadows dancing in the light of a small fire that burned perpetually in the center of the space. Clay pots contained mysterious preparations, powders and tinctures and salves that represented generations of accumulated knowledge about the body's capacity for healing. Kiyu established herself as Belle's self-appointed guardian and translator, sitting cross-legged beside the makeshift bed with the serious expression of someone taking on adult responsibilities. The child's presence proved invaluable as Spotted Owl began her examination, her broken English bridging the gap between languages and cultures that might otherwise have proved insurmountable. "Grandmother say your spirit very strong," Kiyu reported solemnly. "She say most people die from what happened to you, but you still fighting, still wanting to live. That good sign for healing." The healing process began immediately, with Spotted Owl applying poultices and administering teas brewed from plants whose properties had been tested over countless generations. Belle's ankle was bound with strips of soft deer hide, immobilized in a way that would allow the swollen tissues to heal without further damage. Her cuts were cleaned with preparations that stung but carried no risk of the infections that claimed so many lives in this era before modern medicine. Every treatment was accompanied by songs and prayers, the healing arts inseparable from spiritual practice in the Comanche worldview. As Belle's fever broke on the second day and consciousness returned fully, she found herself the center of constant attention from the village women. They brought gifts of food and clothing, offerings that spoke of acceptance despite the vast differences that separated their worlds. Many had lost family members to white soldiers or disease carriers, yet they showed no hostility toward this unexpected guest who had arrived under such unusual circumstances. Their kindness was practical rather than sentimental, based on the simple recognition that all life was sacred and deserving of protection. Among her most frequent visitors was a woman named Dancing Moon, whose husband had been killed in a cavalry raid the previous spring. She spoke no English, but communicated through gestures and expressions that transcended language barriers, sharing stories of her own losses while helping Belle with the basic tasks of eating and cleaning that her injuries made difficult. Dancing Moon's presence taught Belle that grief could coexist with generosity, that personal tragedy did not have to poison the well of human compassion that made survival possible in harsh circumstances. Kiyu appointed herself Belle's teacher in all things Comanche, from basic vocabulary to complex cultural concepts that had no equivalent in the white world. The child's natural gift for languages made her an ideal instructor, her patience unlimited when it came to explaining the difference between formal and casual speech. The subtle meanings conveyed by tone and gesture, the proper way to show respect to elders and warriors. Through these lessons, Belle began to understand that she had not simply been rescued by individuals, but welcomed into a society with its own sophisticated rules and beautiful traditions. Satanta visited the healing lodge daily, his concern evident, despite the stoic expression he maintained in public. He brought reports from scouts about increased army patrols in the region, information that carried ominous implications for everyone in the village. The railroad company was pressuring the military to clear the territory of hostile Indians, offering bounties for captured war chiefs and their families. Belle's presence added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation, since her disappearance would eventually be noticed and investigated by authorities who might trace her to this hidden sanctuary. During these visits, Belle found herself studying the man who had saved her life, trying to understand the thoughts behind his weathered features. Satanta carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, but she glimpsed moments of uncertainty when he thought no one was watching. The responsibility of leadership weighed heavily on his shoulders, complicated by a growing attachment to the broken stranger who had disrupted the careful balance of his world. He spoke to her in halting English, practicing words that Kiyu had taught him, building bridges of communication one syllable at a time. The village children proved to be Belle's most eager students and teachers, fascinated by this pale woman who had fallen from the sky like a character from their oldest stories. They brought her trinkets and treasures, small objects that represented the accumulated wealth of childhood, interesting rocks, pretty feathers, carved wooden animals that had been passed down through generations. Their gifts were accompanied by shy smiles and whispered questions about the world beyond the canyon, about cities and trains and the strange customs of white people that seemed both wonderful and terrifying. As Belle's strength returned, she began to participate more actively in village life, learning skills that would help her contribute to the community that had taken her in. The women taught her to work with buffalo hide, showing her how to scrape and soften the tough material until it became supple as silk. Her fingers, accustomed to embroidery needles and fine silk thread, struggled with the heavier tools and coarser materials, but her teachers were patient and encouraging. Each new skill represented another step away from her old life and toward integration into this new world. The evening gatherings around the central fire became Belle's favorite part of each day, when stories were shared and traditions passed down from elder to younger in the ancient oral tradition that preserved their history and values. She understood only fragments of the words, but the emotions were universal: love, loss, courage, hope, the eternal human struggle to find meaning in the face of uncertainty. These stories taught her that heroism came in many forms, from the warrior who died defending his people to the grandmother who kept their memories alive through the long winters of exile and persecution. Spotted Owl began including Belle in the gathering of medicinal plants, teaching her to recognize the subtle differences between healing herbs and their poisonous cousins. These expeditions into the canyon's hidden places revealed a world of incredible complexity and beauty, where every plant and animal played its part in maintaining the delicate balance that made life possible. Belle learned that the desert she had first seen as empty and hostile was actually teeming with life, a vast pharmacy and grocery store for those who possessed the knowledge to read its offerings. The old healer also shared stories of her own youth, when the Comanche had roamed freely across vast territories, and the white man was merely a rumor from distant lands. She spoke of the time before horses, when her people had been foot nomads following the buffalo herds on foot. She remembered the arrival of the Spanish with their strange animals and metal weapons, the gradual changes that had transformed her world beyond recognition. Through these stories, Belle began to understand the magnitude of loss that her hosts had endured, the civilizations that had been swept away by forces beyond their control. Kiyu's attachment to Belle deepened with each passing day, the child finding in this unexpected mother figure a replacement for the loving presence that had been torn from her life by disease and death. She brought Belle wildflowers each morning, arranged them carefully in clay pots around the healing lodge, and sang the lullabies her own mother had once crooned over her small bed. The bond between them transcended the boundaries of race and language, built on the universal foundation of love and loss that connected all human hearts across the artificial divisions created by fear and ignorance. As Belle's physical healing progressed, she found herself grappling with deeper questions about identity and belonging that her ordeal had forced her to confront. The woman who had jumped from that train no longer existed, replaced by someone who was being slowly reborn in the crucible of this ancient culture. She was learning to see the world through different eyes, to value different things, to find beauty and meaning in places her former self would never have looked. The transformation was as painful as it was liberating, requiring her to let go of everything she had thought she wanted in favor of things she had never known she needed. The canyon itself became her teacher, its red walls echoing with the voices of countless generations who had found shelter and sustenance in its hidden places. She learned to read the signs that predicted weather changes, to find water in seemingly dry stream beds, to identify the calls of different birds and what their presence meant for the day ahead. These skills were more than survival techniques. They were a form of literacy that connected her to the living world in ways her formal education had never provided. But even as Belle found healing and acceptance in the village, clouds were gathering on the horizon that threatened to destroy this fragile peace. Army patrols were increasing in frequency, and the railroad company was offering substantial rewards for information about missing passengers. Her former captors had reported her disappearance, painting her as a kidnapping victim rather than a willing escapee. The machinery of justice was grinding into motion, blind to the truth and driven by assumptions that would bring violence to this peaceful canyon, if not stopped. Satanta felt the weight of these approaching storms, torn between his duty to protect his people and his growing feelings for the woman who had brought both joy and danger into their lives. He watched Belle laughing with the children, saw the light returning to Kiyu's eyes, and knew that whatever came next would test everything he believed about honor, sacrifice, and the price of love. The peaceful interlude was ending, and soon they would all have to face the consequences of the choice to save one broken stranger from the desert's embrace. The first sign of trouble came with the ravens, their harsh cries echoing off the canyon walls like warnings from the spirit world itself. Spotted Owl emerged from her lodge before dawn, studying the flight patterns of the black birds with the intensity of someone reading prophecy in their chaotic dance. She had lived through enough seasons of violence to recognize the omens when they appeared, and the ravens spoke of soldiers riding hard across the desert, their blue uniforms dark against the red sand like bruises on wounded earth. The old woman's weathered hands trembled as she prepared the sacred smoke, sending prayers skyward on threads of burning sage. Belle woke to the sound of urgent voices and rapid footsteps, the peaceful rhythm of village life shattered by an undercurrent of fear that needed no translation. Through the entrance of the healing lodge, she could see warriors checking their weapons and women gathering children close to their sides. Kiyu appeared at her bedside, the child's usual bright chatter replaced by wide-eyed concern that spoke of conversations overheard and adult fears absorbed by a young mind too familiar with loss. "Grandmother say blue coats coming," she whispered, using the Comanche term for cavalry soldiers that Belle had learned to fear during her weeks in the village. Satanta strode into the lodge with the controlled urgency of a leader facing his worst nightmare realized. His usually calm demeanor was cracked around the edges, revealing the strain of protecting a people who had already given up too much to the relentless advance of white civilization. He spoke rapidly to Spotted Owl, his words clipped and precise as they discussed options that grew more limited with each passing hour. The scouts had reported a full company of cavalry riding toward their canyon, led by a railroad detective and guided by Apache trackers, who knew these lands almost as well as the Comanche themselves. The irony was not lost on Belle, that her rescue had become the instrument of potential destruction for the people who had saved her life. She struggled to sit up despite Spotted Owl's gentle protests, her healing body protesting the sudden movement, but her conscience demanding action. "It's because of me," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since her arrival, but heavy with guilt that threatened to crush her spirit. "They're looking for me. I have to go back. I have to turn myself in before anyone gets hurt because of my presence here." Kiyu launched herself at Belle with the fierce protectiveness of a child defending her most precious treasure, small arms wrapping around the woman's waist as tears streamed down her face. "No, Sky Mother, you can't leave us," she sobbed, using the pet name she had invented for Belle during the long days of healing and bonding. "You belong here now. We are your family. The spirits sent you to us for a reason, and that reason isn't finished yet. Papa won't let the blue coats take you away from us. But Satanta's expression was grim as he contemplated the approaching storm, his warrior's mind calculating odds and weighing sacrifices with the cold precision of someone who had made such decisions before. A full company meant 60 soldiers, well-armed and well-supplied, backed by the authority of the United States government and driven by the railroad's desperate need to protect their profitable human trafficking operation. His own band numbered barely 40 warriors, many of them old men and young boys who had never faced trained cavalry in open battle. The canyon that had been their sanctuary could easily become their tomb. Dancing Moon entered the lodge carrying Belle's original dress, now cleaned and mended with meticulous care that spoke of deeper meanings than simple alteration. The torn silk had been reinforced with strips of soft deerskin, the bloodstains removed through patient application of traditional cleaning methods that left no trace of the violence that had brought Belle to them. The garment represented a bridge between worlds, white woman's fashion enhanced with Comanche craftsmanship, belonging fully to neither culture but carrying elements of both. "If you must face the blue coats," Dancing Moon said through Kyu's translation, "you should look like the lady they expect to find, not the Comanche woman you have become." Her words carried layers of meaning that Belle was only beginning to understand. The recognition that survival sometimes required the ability to shift between identities, like a river changing course around obstacles. The dress would be her armor in the battle ahead, a costume that might protect not only herself, but the people who had risked everything to save her. The spotted owl approached with a small leather pouch, its contents mysterious but clearly precious based on the reverence with which she handled it. Inside were herbs and powders that would mask pain, keep the mind clear during stress, and provide the inner strength needed to face whatever ordeal lay ahead. The old healer pressed the pouch into Belle's hands while speaking words in Comanche that needed no translation, the universal language of one woman blessing another's journey into danger. As Belle changed into her repaired dress, she caught her reflection in a polished metal mirror that had been traded from Mexican merchants. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, her pale skin bronzed by desert sun, her soft hands calloused from learning new skills, her eyes holding depths that had not existed before her fall from the train. She was no longer the sheltered banker's daughter who had been sold like livestock to satisfy her father's debts. Nor was she fully Comanche, despite the bonds of love and loyalty that tied her to this hidden village. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls like distant thunder, growing louder with each passing moment until the very air seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of shod horses on stone. Dust clouds rose beyond the canyon mouth, visible even from the village center as the cavalry column approached with the inexorable momentum of a natural disaster. Women began the ancient songs of protection, their voices weaving together in harmonies that had sustained their people through countless trials, while warriors painted their faces with the sacred symbols that would carry their spirits safely to the afterlife if death claimed them. Satanta made his decision with the swift certainty of a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all other counsel. He would ride out to meet the soldiers before they entered the canyon, would attempt to negotiate a peaceful solution that might preserve both Belle's freedom and his people's safety. It was a desperate gamble based on the slim hope that the cavalry commander might be reasonable, that the railroad detective might be satisfied with explanations that did not require violence to resolve. Belle refused to let him face the danger alone, her newfound strength manifesting as stubborn courage that reminded Satanta of his late wife's fierce determination. "I won't hide in the shadows while you risk your life for mine," she declared, her voice carrying the ring of absolute conviction. "If they want me, they can face me directly, but they'll have to acknowledge that I chose to leave that train, that I wasn't kidnapped or coerced, that I found something here worth more than all the gold in their railroad company's vaults." Kyu clung to both adults with desperate intensity, her young mind understanding that this confrontation would change everything regardless of its outcome. The child had already lost one mother to forces beyond her control, and now the woman who had filled that empty space was preparing to walk into danger that might claim her as well. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of fears too large for such small shoulders to bear. The village erupted in controlled chaos as preparations were made for multiple contingencies. Warriors checked their weapons and selected their best horses, ready to fight if diplomacy failed. Women gathered the children and elderly, preparing to evacuate deeper into the canyon system, where hidden passages led to safety among the high mesas. Supplies were cached in secret locations, ensuring survival even if the village itself was destroyed. Every movement was choreographed by years of living under constant threat, a people who had learned to be ready for anything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Belle found herself surrounded by the women who had become her teachers and friends, each offering gifts that carried profound meaning beyond their simple appearance. A necklace of carved bone that would protect her from harm, a bracelet woven with sacred grasses that would ensure her return to the canyon, a small knife whose handle had been blessed by 3 generations of medicine women. These tokens represented more than superstition. They were physical manifestations of love and hope, tangible connections to the family she had found in the most unlikely of places. As the moment of departure arrived, Spotted Owl performed a brief ceremony that bound Belle's spirit to the village, regardless of what physical separation might occur. Sacred smoke was blown over her head while ancient words were spoken, words that claimed her as daughter and sister and member of the clan, with all the rights and responsibilities such membership entailed. The ritual was witnessed by the entire community, making it as binding as any legal document in the White World's courtrooms. Satanta mounted his warhorse, a magnificent black stallion whose bloodlines traced back to the Spanish conquistadors, and whose spirit had never been fully broken by human domestication. The animal sensed the tension in the air, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of approaching strangers and the metallic smell of weapons being prepared for use. Belle was helped onto a gentle mare whose steady temperament would not add unpredictability to an already volatile situation. The small party that rode out to meet the cavalry consisted of Satanta, Belle and 2 of his most trusted warriors, men whose presence would demonstrate strength without appearing threatening enough to provoke immediate violence. They carried no weapons beyond the knives that were tools as much as weapons, relying on diplomacy and truth rather than force to resolve the crisis that Belle's presence had brought to their peaceful canyon. As they approached the canyon mouth, the full magnitude of the threat became visible. 60 mounted soldiers in full battle dress, their brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon sun, their carbines ready for instant use. At their head rode a man whose elaborate uniform marked him as a major, his weathered face bearing the expression of someone who had seen too many Indian wars and was prepared for another. Beside him sat a civilian in an expensive suit, clearly the railroad detective whose investigation had led to this confrontation. The 2 groups faced each other across 100 yards of open ground, the space between them filled with the weight of history and the possibility of tragedy. Behind the soldiers, dust clouds marked the presence of supply wagons and artillery pieces, evidence that this was no routine patrol, but a serious military operation designed to resolve the Indian problem permanently. The railroad had invested too much money in their human trafficking network to allow one escaped victim to expose their crimes. Belle felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, knowing that her next words might determine whether children would sleep safely in their beds tonight, or whether the canyon would echo with the sounds of warfare and mourning. She had jumped from one moving train to escape a fate worse than death, and now she faced the possibility that her rescue had doomed an entire village to destruction. The irony was bitter as desert wind, but it was also an opportunity to choose her own ending rather than having one imposed upon her. Satanta raised his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent, his voice carrying clearly across the space between the opposing forces as he spoke first in Comanche, then in halting English, offering to negotiate rather than fight. The Major's response was predictable, a demand for the immediate surrender of the white woman who had been kidnapped from the railroad, along with compensation for the trouble her rescue had caused. His words carried the casual arrogance of a man who had never questioned his right to dictate terms to people he considered inferior. But Belle had found her voice during her weeks in the canyon, had discovered strength she never knew she possessed, and she would not allow these men to write the ending to her story. She urged her horse forward, placing herself between the two forces as she prepared to speak the words that would either save or damn them all. The moment of truth had arrived, and she would face it as the woman she had become rather than the victim she had once been. Belle urged her mare forward into the no-man's land between the two forces, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The silence that fell over the desert was profound, broken only by the restless stamping of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Every eye was fixed on her as she positioned herself equidistant from the cavalry and the Comanche warriors, a bridge between two worlds that seemed destined for collision. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried across the open ground with surprising strength, each word carefully chosen to cut through the lies and assumptions that had brought them to this precipice. "Major Harrison," she called, reading the name from his uniform insignia with deliberate formality. "I am Isabel Morrison, and I was not kidnapped from your railroad. I jumped from a moving train to escape the men who were transporting me against my will to a forced marriage in Arizona territory. These people found me dying in the desert and saved my life through an act of pure compassion. Any crime that has been committed here was perpetrated by Marcus Thornfield and his associates, not by my rescuers, the railroad detective. A thin man with calculating eyes and expensive clothes that spoke of profits built on human misery, spurred his horse forward with obvious agitation. His face had gone pale beneath his carefully waxed mustache, the confident arrogance of moments before, replaced by the dawning realization that his carefully constructed narrative was crumbling before his eyes. "Miss Morrison, you have clearly been subjected to mental duress by these savages," he said, his voice carrying the oily persuasion of a practiced liar. "Stockholm Syndrome is well documented in cases of prolonged captivity. We're here to rescue you from this terrible ordeal." Belle's laugh was sharp as breaking glass, cutting through the detective's patronizing words with surgical precision. "Rescue me, Mr. Blackwood? The same way you rescued me from my father's house in Philadelphia. The same way you arranged my rescue to a mining camp brothel in Arizona. Your definition of rescue seems remarkably similar to what most people would call slavery." Her words hit their target with devastating accuracy, and she could see the detective's composure cracking as his carefully hidden crimes were dragged into the harsh desert sunlight. Major Harrison, a career soldier whose honest face had been weathered by years of frontier service, was beginning to look deeply uncomfortable with the situation he had been thrust into. His orders had been simple: retrieve the kidnapped woman and punish the Indians responsible for taking her. But the woman before him bore no resemblance to the helpless victim described in Blackwood's reports. Her bearing was proud, her voice strong, and her accusations carried the ring of truth that his experienced ear recognized immediately. "Ma'am," the major said carefully, his military training warring with his growing suspicions about the true nature of this operation, "are you saying that you voluntarily left the railroad and chose to remain with these Indians? Because if that's the case, then this entire expedition was launched under false pretenses." His words carried a weight of implication that made Blackwood shift nervously in his saddle. Suddenly aware that his web of lies was beginning to unravel, Belle seized the moment. her voice rising with the passion of someone who had found her purpose in the crucible of near death and rebirth. "I'm saying, Major, that I was sold by my own father to satisfy his gambling debts. I was being transported like livestock to a man who buys women the way other men buy cattle. When I chose freedom over slavery, these people could have left me to die in the desert. Instead, they showed me kindness that my own people never did. They healed my broken body and taught me what family truly means." Satanta watched the proceedings with the patient attention of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His dark eyes missing nothing as the white woman's words systematically destroyed the justification for the cavalry's presence. He had seen enough military expeditions to recognize the signs of uncertainty in the ranks, the way soldiers began to question orders when the moral foundation beneath them shifted. The young troopers behind Major Harrison were exchanging glances that spoke of growing doubt about their mission. Blackwood's desperation was becoming palpable as his carefully orchestrated plan collapsed around him like a house built on sand. The railroad company had paid him handsomely to retrieve their property and eliminate any witnesses to their human trafficking operation. If Bell's testimony reached the authorities, it would expose a criminal network that extended from Philadelphia's banking district to the mining camps of Arizona Territory. His next words carried the venom of a cornered snake. "Major, this woman has clearly been brainwashed by prolonged exposure to savage culture," Blackwood insisted, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. "She's not competent to make decisions about her own welfare. I have legal documents proving that she is the property of Ezekiel Crenshaw, purchased in good faith through legitimate business arrangements. These Indians are harboring stolen property and must be made to surrender her immediately." The word property hung in the air like a curse, and Bell felt the rage that had been building for months finally break free of the restraints that civilization had taught her to maintain. "Property?" she repeated, her voice cutting through the desert air like a blade. "I am no man's property, Mr. Blackwood. I never consented to any sale or marriage. The documents you carry are forgeries designed to legalize kidnapping and human trafficking. And if you try to take me from these people who saved my life, you'll discover that I would rather die free than live as a slave." Major Harrison had heard enough to convince him that something was deeply wrong with this entire operation. His military code demanded protection of innocent civilians, not enforcement of what appeared to be criminal enterprise disguised as legal business. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a man who had decided where his duty truly lay. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to need to see those documents you mentioned. And I'm going to need some answers about how this young lady came to be on that train in the first place." The detective's response was swift and desperate, his hand moving toward the concealed weapon beneath his coat as he realized that his careful plans were disintegrating beyond salvage. But Satanta had been watching for exactly such a move, and his own response was lightning quick. The Comanche war chief's knife left his hand in a fluid motion that spoke of decades of practice, burying itself in Blackwood's shoulder before the detective could draw his hidden pistol. The man screamed and tumbled from his horse, clutching his wounded arm as blood seeped between his fingers. The sudden violence triggered an explosive chain reaction as nervous soldiers reached for their weapons, uncertain whether they were facing an attack or witnessing justified defense. Major Harrison's voice cut through the chaos like a cavalry saber, his commands delivered with the snap of absolute authority. "Stand down! All of you, stand down! Nobody shoots unless I give the order." His years of leadership showed as his men immediately obeyed, the discipline overriding their fear and confusion. Bell dismounted quickly and moved to where Blackwood writhed in the sand, his expensive clothes now stained with dust and blood. She knelt beside him, with the gentle competence she had learned from Spotted Owl, applying pressure to his wound with strips torn from her own dress. "You're not going to die, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, her voice carrying no malice despite everything he had done to her. "But you are going to prison, And you're going to help us expose every person involved in this trafficking network. The detective's eyes were wide with shock and pain, but also with the dawning realization that his world was crumbling around him. "You don't understand," he gasped, his voice weak but desperate. "The people involved in this go all the way to Washington. Railroad money, banking interests, mining companies. They'll kill us all before they let this exposure happen. You've signed all our death warrants by refusing to play your part." Major Harrison approached with his sidearm drawn, but pointed safely downward, his weathered face grim as the full scope of the corruption he had been unwittingly serving became clear. "Miss Morrison, if what you're saying is true, then I owe these people an apology, and I owe you an escort back to civilization where you can testify before proper authorities. But first, I need to know if you're truly here of your own free will." Belle rose to her feet, her dress stained with Blackwood's blood, but her bearing proud and uncompromising. Around her, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, reminding her of all the lessons she had learned during her weeks in the hidden canyon. "Major, I am here because these people chose compassion over suspicion, healing over hatred. I'm here because a little girl convinced her father that all life is sacred, regardless of the color of skin or the circumstances of birth. I am here because I finally found a family that values me for who I am, rather than what I can bring to a business transaction." Satanta had retrieved his knife and now stood beside his horse, ready for whatever violence might still erupt, but hopeful that wisdom might prevail over bloodshed. When he spoke, his words were careful and measured, delivered in the halting English he had been practicing during Belle's recovery. "Major Soldier Chief, Skywoman, speak truth. We find her broken, near death. We heal because it is right thing to do. We ask nothing from your people except to be left in peace." The cavalry officer studied the Comanche war chief with new respect, recognizing in Satanta's bearing the dignity of a true leader who had made difficult choices based on principle rather than profit. "Chief Satanta, I believe I owe you and your people an apology. We came here based on false information, seeking to right a wrong that was never committed. If Miss Morrison chooses to remain with your band, that is her right as a free American citizen." But Belle shook her head, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute truth. "Major, I appreciate your respect for my choices, but I can't stay here. Not because I don't want to, but because my presence puts these people in constant danger. As long as I'm here, there will always be another Blackwood, another corrupt official, another military expedition. The only way to protect my adopted family is to leave them and fight this battle in the white man's courts." Kiyu's anguished cry echoed off the canyon walls as she broke from the group of hidden watchers and ran toward Belle with desperate speed. The child had been listening from concealment, her young heart breaking as she realized that the sky mother she had claimed and loved was preparing to leave them again. "No," she sobbed, throwing herself into Belle's arms with the fierce desperation of someone losing everything for the second time. "You promised you would stay. You promised you were our family now." Belle caught the child against her chest, her own tears flowing freely as she held the little girl who had become more precious to her than life itself. "Oh, my brave little warrior," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I will always be your family. Distance cannot change that. Blood cannot change that. But sometimes we have to be apart for a while so that we can be together safely forever. Do you understand? I have to go fight the bad men so they can never hurt our people again." Satanta approached slowly, his own emotions carefully controlled but visible in the tightness around his eyes, and the way his weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached out to touch Belle's shoulder. "Sky Woman speaks wisdom," he said, his voice heavy with loss but firm with acceptance. "She must walk the path that leads to justice, even if that path takes her far from our canyon. But she carries our love with her, and that will bring her home when the fighting is done." Major Harrison, deeply moved by the scene before him and ashamed of his role in forcing this separation, cleared his throat and stepped forward with military formality that barely concealed his emotional turmoil. "Miss Morrison, I pledge to you the full protection of the United States Army during your journey to testify against these criminals. And I pledge to Chief Setanta that no harm will come to his people because of their kindness to you. You have my word as an officer and a gentleman." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that transformed the harsh landscape into something approaching beauty. Belle looked around at the red rocks and endless sky that had become her sanctuary, at the faces of the people who had taught her what love truly meant, and felt her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. She was leaving paradise, but she was taking its lessons with her into a world that desperately needed to learn about compassion and justice. As the cavalry prepared to escort Belle back to civilization and Blackwood to military custody, the two groups that had faced each other as enemies began the delicate process of becoming allies in the fight against corruption. The railroad detective's wounded shoulder would heal, but his criminal empire was finished. The documents in his saddlebags would provide evidence of a trafficking network that reached into the highest levels of government and business, and Belle's testimony would be the key that unlocked justice for countless other victims. But as she prepared to mount her horse for the journey back to the white man's world, Belle made one final promise to the family that had saved her life and taught her soul to soar. "I will come back," she said, her voice carrying the absolute conviction of a woman who had found her true home. "When the courts have heard the truth and the guilty have been punished, I will come back to stay. This canyon is my heart's home, and no law or custom will keep me from returning to the people who gave me life when I was dying in the desert." 2 years had passed since Belle Morrison walked out of the desert canyon that had become her heart's true home. 2 years of courtrooms and testimony, of facing down corrupt officials and dismantling a criminal empire that had operated in shadows for decades. The trials had made headlines from Philadelphia to San Francisco, exposing a network of human trafficking that reached into banking houses, railroad boardrooms, and territorial governments. Belle's courage in speaking truth to power had inspired other victims to come forward, creating an avalanche of justice that swept away men who had thought themselves untouchable. The autumn wind carried the scent of changing seasons across the Texas plains as Belle guided her horse along the familiar trail toward the hidden canyon, her heart racing with anticipation that had built for months during the final legal proceedings. Behind her rode a small wagon train carrying supplies and gifts for the people who had saved her life, tokens of gratitude that could never truly repay the debt she owed to Setanta's band. Her escort consisted of 2 cavalry officers, friends now rather than guards, who had volunteered to ensure her safe passage through territory still considered dangerous by most white settlers. The trials had changed Belle in ways that went far deeper than the legal victory she had achieved. Standing before judges and juries, facing down the most powerful men in multiple states, had forged her into something harder and more determined than the frightened woman who had once jumped from a speeding train. She had become a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for those who could not speak for themselves. But success had not dulled her longing for the simple peace she had found among the red rocks and sagebrush of her adopted home. Marcus Thornfield and his brother had received life sentences for their crimes, their network of flesh peddlers exposed and destroyed by testimony that Belle had delivered with unwavering courage. Ezekiel Crenshaw's mining empire had collapsed when his treatment of women became public knowledge, his political connections severed by scandals that reached into territorial capitals and federal offices. The railroad company had paid millions in damages to victims, their stock worthless, and their executives facing criminal charges that would keep them in prison for decades. But Belle's greatest victory had been personal rather than legal. Standing in that final courtroom, delivering her closing statement to a jury of men who had never imagined that such horrors existed in their civilized world. She had felt the presence of every woman who had been bought and sold like cattle. Her words had carried the weight of their suffering and the power of their collective demand for justice. When the verdicts were read and the guilty were led away in chains, she had known that she had fulfilled her obligation to fight the monsters in the only arena where they could be truly defeated. The familiar landmarks began to appear as her small party approached the canyon mouth. Red rock formations that rose like ancient guardians protecting the hidden valley beyond. Belle's escort reined in their horses at her request, understanding that this final approach must be made alone, that some reunions were too sacred for witnesses. She had dreamed of this moment through 2 years of legal battles, through nights when testimony brought back memories that made sleep impossible, through days when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush her spirit. As she rode into the canyon alone, Belle was struck by how little had changed in the hidden valley that had sheltered her during the darkest period of her life. The same buffalo hide tipis dotted the canyon floor, arranged in patterns that spoke of ancient wisdom and deep understanding of harmony between human needs and natural forces. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children's laughter echoed off the stone walls, and the eternal rhythm of life continued as it had for countless generations. The first person to spot her approach was a young warrior she didn't recognize, clearly one of many who had joined the band during her absence. He called out in Comanche, his voice carrying news that spread through the village like wildfire, as people emerged from their lodges to witness the impossible sight of Sky Woman returning as she had promised. The welcome that greeted her was overwhelming. A chorus of voices raised in celebration and joy that brought tears to her eyes and made her heart swell with emotions too large for words. Spotted Owl appeared from her healing lodge, the elderly woman moving more slowly than Belle remembered, but with the same dignity and wisdom that had made her such a powerful force in the community. The healer's weathered face broke into a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire canyon as she raised her arms in greeting to the daughter who had returned from the white man's world. Her words, spoken in flowing Comanche, needed no translation as they carried the universal language of love and welcome that transcended all barriers. But it was Kiu's cry of pure joy that cut through all other sounds. The now 9-year-old girl racing toward Belle with the speed of a prairie wind and the grace of a young deer. She had grown taller and stronger during their separation, her face showing the first hints of the beautiful woman she would become. But her eyes still held the same bright spirit that had convinced her father to save a dying stranger 2 years ago. When she reached Belle's horse, she was laughing and crying simultaneously, her words tumbling over each other in a mixture of Comanche and English that spoke of excitement too great for any single language to contain. Belle dismounted quickly and caught the child in her arms, holding her close while both of them wept tears of reunion that washed away 2 years of separation and sorrow. Kiu had grown, but she still fit perfectly against Belle's heart, still felt like the missing piece that had made her whole during the darkest period of her life. "My brave little warrior," Belle whispered, using the pet name that had always been theirs alone. "I told you I would come back. I told you that love was stronger than distance or time." The crowd that gathered around them was larger than Belle remembered, evidence that the band had prospered during her absence, despite the challenges that constantly faced their people. New faces mingled with familiar ones, children who had been born since her departure, and elders who had joined the band seeking the security and peace that Setanta's leadership provided. The growth spoke of hope and renewal, of a community that had not merely survived, but thrived in spite of the pressures that surrounded them. Setanta approached with the measured dignity that had always marked his bearing, but Belle could see the emotion in his dark eyes, the carefully controlled joy that spoke of a heart that had never given up hope despite the odds against her return. He had aged during their separation, new lines around his eyes and silver threads in his black hair that spoke of the responsibilities he carried and the price of leadership in dangerous times. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by years of making hard decisions and bearing burdens that would have crushed lesser men. "Sky Woman returns to us as the eagles promised," he said, his words carrying formal weight, but his tone warm with personal affection. "The spirits whispered of your victories in the white man's courts, of justice delivered to those who traffic in human suffering. You have honored the gifts they gave you when they brought you to our canyon, and now you return to claim the place that has always been yours among our people." His English had improved dramatically during her absence, evidence of his determination to bridge the gap between their worlds. Bell reached out to touch his weathered hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a life spent working with horses and weapons, building and defending, providing for and protecting the people who depended on his strength and wisdom. "I return because this is where my heart has always remained," she said, her voice carrying the certainty that had sustained her through 2 years of legal battles and courtroom confrontations. "I return because a little girl once convinced her father that all life is sacred, and that lesson changed everything about who I am and what I believe." The celebration that followed stretched through the afternoon and into the evening, a feast that brought the entire community together in recognition of a homecoming that had seemed impossible when Belle first rode away with the cavalry escort. Stories were shared of the intervening years, of battles fought and victories won, of children born and elders who had passed into the spirit world with their memories intact and their dignity preserved. Belle learned that the band had grown stronger rather than weaker, that her sacrifice had indeed protected them from the retribution that might have followed her presence. Dancing Moon, now showing the silver hair of a respected elder herself, brought Belle gifts that spoke of remembrance and continuity. A new dress crafted in the Comanche style, but made from the finest materials that traders could provide. Beadwork that told the story of her journey from broken stranger to beloved daughter. And a necklace whose stones had been blessed by 3 generations of medicine women. Each gift carried meaning beyond its physical form, representing acceptance and belonging that went deeper than blood or birth. As the sun set behind the canyon walls and the evening stars began their eternal dance across the desert sky, Belle found herself sitting beside the central fire, with Kiyu curled against her side, and Satanta's strong presence anchoring her to the moment. The child had refused to leave her side since her arrival, as if afraid that distance might somehow cause her adopted mother to vanish again like smoke in the wind. The conversations around the fire were conducted in the mixture of languages that had become natural to this community. Comanche and English and Spanish, weaving together like the threads in a complex tapestry. Spotted Owl approached the fire carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, her movement ceremonial and filled with significance that hushed the conversations around the circle. Inside the bundle was a document that Belle recognized immediately, the deed to a small ranch that bordered the Canyonlands, property that had been purchased through careful negotiation with territorial authorities during her absence. The legal papers represented more than ownership. They represented a bridge between worlds that would allow her to live in both without abandoning either. The white man's law requires papers to make belonging official, Spotted Owl explained through Q's translation, her voice carrying the dry humor that had always marked her observations about the strange customs of the outside world. "So we obtained papers that say what our hearts have always known. This land is yours by right of love and sacrifice, by the choice you made to fight for justice, even when it meant leaving everything you treasured. Now the law agrees with what the spirits decided long ago." Belle stared at the deed in wonder, understanding that this gift represented far more than mere property ownership. It was recognition of her dual nature, acknowledgement that she could be both white woman and Comanche daughter. both legal advocate and desert dweller, both individual and member of the collective that had given her life meaning. The ranch would allow her to establish a school, a place where children from both cultures could learn together, where the artificial barriers between peoples might begin to crumble. Hugh looked up at her with eyes that sparkled with excitement and possibility, her young mind already racing ahead to the adventures that awaited them in this new chapter of their shared story. "Will you teach me to read the white man's books?" she asked, her English now fluent and confident despite her Comanche accent. "Will you teach me the words that have power in the courts where you fought for justice? I want to be like you, Sky Mother. I want to be someone who can walk between worlds and make them both better." Satanta's hand found Belle's across the space between them, his weathered fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that spoke of promises made and kept, of love that had survived separation and grown stronger in the testing. "The eagles told us you would return when the time was right," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the desert stillness. "They also told us that your return would mark the beginning of something new, something that has never existed before, but that the spirits have been preparing for many seasons." As the fire burned lower and the celebration gradually gave way to the peaceful quiet of the desert night, Belle found herself surrounded by the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. The woman who had jumped from a speeding train to escape slavery had become someone who could build bridges between cultures, who could fight for justice while honoring tradition, who could love across the boundaries that others saw as absolute and unchanging. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had watched over countless generations of people who had found refuge in this hidden canyon. Belle closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of home, children's sleepy murmurs, the soft conversations of adults around dying fires, the distant call of night birds hunting among the rocks. She had traveled far and fought hard to reach this moment of perfect peace. This place where past and future converged in a present that held everything she had ever wanted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, plans to be made for the school that would bridge two worlds, legal matters to be resolved regarding her permanent residence in territory that still officially belonged to no recognized government. But tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for the simple joy of being exactly where she belonged, with the people who had taught her what family truly meant. The last words spoken around the dying fire came from Kiu, now drowsy but still clinging to the woman who had kept her promise to return, despite all the forces that might have prevented it. "The spirits knew what they were doing when they sent you to us," the child murmured, her voice soft with approaching sleep. "They knew we needed you just as much as you needed us. They knew that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into." Belle smiled as she watched the embers fade to glowing ash, understanding finally that her journey had never been about escape or rescue or even justice, though all of those had played their parts in the story. It had been about finding the place where her soul could rest, the people who could see her true self and love her not despite her flaws, but because of her humanity. She had jumped from a train to escape bondage and found freedom in the most unlikely of places, among people her former world would have called savages, but who had shown her what civilization truly meant. 5 years had passed since Belle Morrison first jumped from that speeding train into the unforgiving Texas desert, and the woman who now stood before the graduating class of Canyon Bridge Academy bore little resemblance to the desperate banker's daughter who had once been sold like livestock to satisfy gambling debts. Her hair showed threads of silver at the temples, her hands were calloused from honest work, and her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering and joy discovered in the most unlikely places. The school she had built stood as testament to the power of love to transcend boundaries that others considered absolute and unchanging. The graduating class of 1874 was unlike any other in the American territories. a mixture of Comanche children and white settlers' offspring, who had learned to see past the artificial divisions that kept their parents' worlds apart. 12 young people sat before her, in clothes that blended traditions from both cultures, their faces bright with the confidence that came from understanding multiple ways of seeing the world. Among them sat Kiyu, now 12 years old and preparing to enter the Territorial Teachers College in Austin, her young mind sharp as a blade and her heart still filled with the compassion that had first saved Belle's life. "Today you leave this canyon carrying gifts that cannot be stolen or destroyed," Belle addressed her students, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked between worlds and found truth in both. "You carry the wisdom of two peoples, the strength that comes from understanding that difference is not division, and the knowledge that love is more powerful than hatred. You are living proof that the barriers men build in their minds need not exist in their hearts." Satanta stood at the back of the small classroom, his presence a source of strength and pride as he watched the woman he loved shape the minds of the next generation. Marriage between them had come naturally 3 years after Belle's return, a ceremony that honored both Comanche tradition and territorial law, witnessed by government officials and tribal elders who recognized that their union represented something unprecedented in the troubled history between their peoples. Their own children played in the canyon beyond the schoolhouse walls, a son and daughter whose mixed heritage would prepare them for a world that was slowly, painfully learning to accept change. The academy had grown from Belle's dream into a reality that attracted attention from educators across the nation. Visitors who came expecting to find a crude frontier school, but discovered instead an institution that challenged everything they thought they knew about learning and community. Students mastered both English literature and Comanche oral tradition, studied mathematics alongside traditional ecological knowledge, learned American history while understanding the indigenous perspective that textbooks ignored. The graduates went forth as bridges between worlds that desperately needed connection. Major Harrison, now retired from military service and serving as the territorial representative for Indian affairs, had become an unexpected ally in Belle's educational mission. His transformation from cavalry officer to advocate for peace demonstrated the power of truth to change even the most hardened hearts. He attended every graduation ceremony, bringing with him government officials who needed to see proof that cooperation between cultures was not only possible, but profitable for everyone involved. Miss Morrison's Academy produces students who excel in any environment they enter, the Major had written in his official reports to Washington. They possess language skills, cultural competency, and problem-solving abilities that make them invaluable as interpreters, negotiators, and leaders. This institution represents the future of territorial development, a model that should be replicated rather than merely tolerated. The success stories of previous graduates had become legend throughout the territory. Young men and women who served as translators for government delegations, who established trading posts that brought prosperity to both communities, who became teachers and doctors and lawyers, carrying the lessons of the canyon into the wider world. They were living proof that Belle's vision of unity was more than idealistic dreaming, that practical benefits flowed from the radical notion that all children deserved education regardless of their racial heritage. Dancing Moon, now the Academy's cultural teacher and Belle's closest friend among the women, had documented the school's impact in detailed records that would one day become historical treasures. Her careful notes captured not just academic achievements, but the deeper transformations that occurred when prejudice gave way to understanding, when fear was replaced by friendship, when the artificial barriers between peoples dissolved in the face of shared humanity and common goals. The afternoon ceremony concluded with songs in both languages, melodies that wove together like the lives of the people who sang them. Parents from both communities stood side by side, their initial suspicions long since replaced by mutual respect and genuine affection. White settlers had learned that Comanche wisdom about land management and sustainable living could improve their own farming efforts, while tribal members had discovered that certain aspects of white technology and legal knowledge could protect their interests in a changing world. As the families departed and the canyon settled into its evening quiet, Belle found herself walking alone among the red rocks where she had first been found dying 5 years ago. The place that had witnessed her lowest moment now stood as symbol of her greatest triumph, a reminder that endings could become beginnings when courage and compassion intersected at exactly the right moment. The desert wind carried the voices of her students as they rode toward their various homes, their laughter echoing off the stone walls like music from the spirit world. Kiyu approached her adopted mother with the careful reverence that marked all their private moments together, understanding that this place held sacred significance for the woman who had become the center of her universe. "Sky Mother," she said, using the name that had evolved from childhood endearment into formal title of respect. "What are you thinking about as you stand here where everything began?" Her English was now perfect, her Comanche equally fluent, her young mind already grasping concepts that would have challenged adults from either culture. Belle smiled and drew the girl close, feeling the same rush of protective love that had sustained her through the darkest moments of legal battles and social opposition. "I'm thinking about how many times I thought my story was ending when it was really just beginning," she replied, her voice soft with wonder at the unexpected turns that had brought her to this moment of perfect peace. "I'm thinking about how jumping from that train was the best decision I ever made, even though it seemed like the most terrifying." The lights of the settlement below began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Lanterns in windows that represented homes where families gathered around dinner tables to share the events of their days. Some of those families included children of mixed heritage. Others consisted of traditional households that had learned to extend their definitions of kinship and community. The canyon that had once been a hiding place for refugees had become a beacon of hope for anyone brave enough to imagine a different kind of future. Satanta's voice carried across the evening air as he called them back toward the settlement, his tone carrying the gentle authority of a father and husband whose greatest joy lay in the safety and happiness of his family. Belle took Kiyu's hand, and together they walked toward the lights of home, their footsteps echoing the rhythm of countless generations who had found shelter and sustenance in this hidden valley among the red rocks. "Will you tell me the story again tonight?" Kiyu asked, her request carrying the ritual weight of a bedtime tradition that had sustained them both through the years since Belle's return. The story about the woman who jumped from the iron horse and fell into a new life? The child never tired of hearing the tale that had shaped her own destiny, never lost her wonder at the miraculous chain of events that had brought them together. Belle nodded, understanding that this story belonged not just to her, but to all the children who would grow up in the world they were building together. A world where courage could triumph over cruelty, where love could bridge any distance, where the bonds of chosen family could prove stronger than the accidents of birth. "Yes, my brave little warrior," she said, using the endearment that would always connect them to that first moment of recognition in the desert. "I'll tell you the story of how the spirit sent a broken woman to teach us that healing requires both medicine and love." The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky above the canyon, the same constellations that had witnessed Belle's desperate leap from the speeding train and her gradual transformation from victim to survivor to teacher and leader. Those stars had watched over countless stories of human struggle and triumph, but few could match the tale of the woman who had jumped into the void and found not death but life, not isolation but family, not despair but hope beyond all reasonable expectation. As mother and daughter disappeared into the warm glow of their home, The desert wind carried their voices and laughter across the red rocks and scattered sage, a sound that spoke of possibilities fulfilled and dreams made manifest through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing love over fear. The canyon would continue to shelter and sustain future generations, but it would always remember the day when a desperate woman fell from the sky and a compassionate child convinced her father that mercy was stronger than suspicion. The legacy of Belle Morrison, the Sky Woman who had bridged two worlds through her willingness to sacrifice safety for justice and comfort for truth, would endure long after the red rocks themselves crumbled to dust. Her story would be told and retold, inspiring others to leap into the unknown when staying safe meant abandoning their souls, reminding future generations that the most profound transformations often began with the most desperate acts of faith. In the end, she had discovered that freedom was not something to be granted by others, but something to be claimed through courage, that family was not defined by blood, but by choice, and that home was not a place on any map, but a feeling in the heart that said, "Here I belong, here I am loved, here I can become everything I was meant to be." The woman who had jumped from a moving train to escape bondage had found not just liberty, but purpose, not just safety, but meaning, not just survival, but a legacy that would echo through generations yet unborn. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.